Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone. The last topic in this module that we are going to cover is the Indian case. In order to understand the Indian case, I have identified three main sources. If you look at these papers, the research papers, they are published in renowned journals like Research Policy, Technovation, and what is important is the timeline. For instance, paper by Desai is published in 1980 and Forbes in 1999 and another one in 2016, and I have also updated the data by using the CTIR's handbook of 2018-19. Now, why these dates are important, I'll just explain. If we look at the Indian economy and the major changes in the policy that it has experienced after independence, can be divided into two main phases. First one, the restrictive phase, where you have policy which was essentially that of a regulation. The industrial policy also had much more control in terms of imports of technology, imports of final goods, as well as the production capacities. Following the major economic reforms in 1991, what we find is that the markets become much more competitive. The major changes that started after this economic reforms were related to liberalization, privatization and globalization. After that, we entered into the 21st century, and clearly the changes that were brought in 1991 began to bear fruit. So now, if I look at the research articles, the first one will give us the overall picture with respect to the origin and direction of industrial R&D in India immediately after independence and within the regulated industrial regime. The second paper will talk about the immediate response of the Indian industry to changes in the competitive market, where they suddenly find that the competition is now open to foreign firms, and as a result they have to find or formulate a strategy with respect to their innovation activities in order to survive. Once we start with the 21st century, clearly the changes that have been brought after the economic liberalization has begun to give benefits or bear fruit. So what is the response of the Indian industry immediately after liberalization vis-a-vis what is now happening what has been going on in the last 2 decades is of much interest to us. Now in these slides we will basically focusing on the two major outcomes of the research and innovation activities, essentially focusing on the investments that are made, what is it that firms are engaged in, what has been the role of the government, how it has changed post-liberalization, and what are the major challenges which are now being faced by the Indian industry, and what are the major focuses, what could be the major focuses for the policy makers. So once we start immediately after the independence, at that time one has to understand that the national innovation system indeed evolved along with the inward-looking industrial policy regime. The overall objective in alignment with that inward-looking industrial policy regime was also to attain self-reliance technology-wise. That means in order to ensure that we became self-reliant, more and more indigenization was given prominence by the industry as well as by the government. Imports were rather restricted. Now that has also led to a major investments by the government in the R&D institutions. They were investing in the public funded research laboratories in universities, academic institutions, and a massive institution building happened immediately after the independence. Clearly, the objective of the policy was to protect the local technical effort by strictly regulating it and also reducing the import or restricting the import of the technology. Indigenization, self-reliance, do-it-yourself kind of an approach was being encouraged. Here also what we find that the state, that is the government, indeed dominated the research and development in India since independence, both as a doer as well as funder. So from 1956 onwards, what you find, industrial licensing, foreign exchange control over all transactions, they resulted in direct control of import of capital, intermediate and consumer goods, that also fed into the way the research and development was being conducted by the companies. So what was being done by the companies? Let us have a look at that. So since 1950s, we find the government funded and conducted over 80% of the formal research and development. And in 1958, the privately owned companies, they were spending a very minuscule amount of 2 million rupees on research and development. That increased considerably to 367 million rupees. And the share itself also increased. Initially, CSIR, which was the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, was in fact spending around 93% of the research and development in the entire country. Its share actually went down to 23%. That is also with respect to the increase in the fund from the privately owned companies. Moreover, when we look at the research and development fund by the government, there was an agency called National Research Development Corporation, which was playing a very prominent role in selling the technology of CSIR and other government labs to the private enterprises. If we look at this entire time period, we find that the distribution, if we talk about in terms of the different industry, it is in alignment with what has been going on internationally in US and UK. That is, the industries like chemicals, instruments, electronics, electricals, machinery and transport equipment, they were rather relatively research intensive industries in India. And there was also certain divergences. What was the major divergence? Is that a large portion of R&D at that point of a time in corporate sector was also being supported by the government in OECD countries. So this was a major point of departure, and this was in fact missing in India during 1969 and 70. And this National Research Development Corporation was associated with CSIR, engaging with the technologies being produced by CSR so that they can go and sell it in the market. Also sometimes give loan or equity capital to enterprises to buy the technology also. And the important point here was that the amount that they were engaged in was rather very small. So what you find is that by and large the government funds were being spent in the government laboratories and not even in those of public enterprises. In fact, this is one of the major reasons that you find that the research which was going on at that time failed to reach the market. So what was private sector doing? We have found that the number has increased from 2 million to more than 300 million rupees from 1968 to 1970s. So what is that the focus of private sector? What we find is that the private sector was indeed engaged in more adaptive R&D. What do we mean by that? That they were essentially engaged in quality control, technical services, material adaptation, plant construction, and many times ad hoc technical activities. They were also developed into R&D programs. And if you look at the activities of the small firm, they were concentrated essentially on adaptation of the raw material or on the process improvement itself. So the research by Desai shows that most of the R&D, in fact the large firms were spending around 40% of their R&D budget on equipment construction and product improvement. Hence the overall emphasis being the adaptive research and development. The study has also, I would encourage you to read the full paper, has very interestingly given the examples of 3 companies particularly related to developments that has been happened. So one such was by Tata Engineering and Locomotive Company. So what did this company do? In fact, they were into diesel engines, and they conducted a field survey, essentially to look into the performance of the engines, and that they were trying to fit at that point of a time in the existing range of the trucks. And with the help of the study, they got the information about the required improvement in the engines itself, and it also rather required certain major modification. And these modifications which were then introduced in fact led to a major improvement in the market and in terms of the products that was available. And in fact they also entered into marine engines at that point of a time. Similarly, there is another example of Jyoti Limited. Jyoti Limited was again developing a series of low capacity water turbines, and they kind of realized that there was a market for small hydroelectric generating plants, particularly in the hilly areas, and it was not met, and hence they went into that particular direction. The another example comes from Excel Industries, again picking up from the research of Professor Desai, who pointed out that Excel Industries is in fact at that time was manufacturing phosphoric acid from very commonly used as red phosphorus. But what the problem was that the process was rather hazardous, and over a period of a time the engagement of the Excel industry led to the development of a better process to manufacture organophosphoric pesticides. So these activities, understanding the market, accordingly introducing the engines, identifying the need for the hydroelectric generating plants in the hilly areas, and also coming up with the better processes that further led to a different and a better product was also being witnessed. But if you look at it, most of these activities were conducted within the development. That may be broadly defined as work which directed to translate the proposal which is rather known and into the possible manufacturing operations. And this kind of a development projects are related to the maybe coming up of an operation of an equipment, or identifying the operational challenges that are being faced, and then introducing the new ways of doing things or the new inventions. At that time, the research has realized that there were major challenges which were being faced by the private sector. So private sector in any case in a developing economy can either decide to make or indigenize the technology or buy it from the international market. However, buying decision would rather require government permission. That has major restrictions to it. As a result, the focus end up being indigenization and identifying the technologies which are rather available internationally and then coming up with its own version. In fact, clearly if the technology involved something which was a building of a new plant or talking about entirely which is outside the experience, then they have to kind of engage with the external parties. However, that required substantial increase in the R&D investment, and as a result the idea was that the general tendency of the research and development projects which were being undertaken by the corporate sector was on a short-term payoff, so that they could rather look at the moderate or a medium-sized capital requirement, because any kind of a major change would entail depending on the external parties to purchase, and those purchases rather was very difficult because of the regulatory regime that the companies were operating on. And moreover, if you look at it in terms of the priorities that the companies had at that point of a time, the immediate gains were rather of much concern as compared to the long run strategies that they may have. In fact, if you look at it, the kind of a forced import substitution which was there, that means that the firm were not able to have an access to commonly used abroad and local substitute. They have to be rather developed, adapted, and moreover, whatever was being also imported in terms of technology also needed a lot of effort, work in the adaptation process itself. It was not that it was very easy to adapt all those kind of imported technologies as per the temperature requirements, as per the raw material requirements, or any other specific situations that may entail in the country. Apart from that, companies were hiring scientists and researchers. Many of them were trained abroad. They were also paying them rather a relatively higher compensation as compared to the one which may be located in the public sector. Though scientists and researchers may be more interested in continuing with the public funded institutions, because there they can publish more, they can go for conferences nationally and internationally, which may be much interest to the academician. But there was a presence of research R&D managers and scientists in the private sector, and they were contributing towards the research that was going on at that point of time. The another major concern was with respect to the patent law. So we will have a very long discussion on the changes in the Indian patent policy, as we will identify it as an important institution to incentivize innovation. So we will have more discussion here, but here we can simply say that following the independence, major changes were introduced in the Indian patent policy that was in alignment with the social and economic realities of that particular point of a time. Food crisis was something which was staring the country at that point of a time, and also healthcare was of a paramount importance. So the company in fact reduced and not reduced, did away with the product patent for food and healthcare products, and particularly pharmaceutical, and they also reduced the time duration. So these changes were being introduced later again in 1990s in order to comply with the TRIPS agreement. Once again, the country has to change the patent laws or amend the patent laws. But at the same time, during this time also, we find that there was a friction between Indian and the foreign company, and a very famous case of that Huxet vis-a-vis the Unicom laboratories was being talked about, and at that time, based on the ruling of the court, it was decided that yes, the Unicom actually infringed the patent of the foreign company. So there was this kind of a friction which was being realized, and in response to that, and in response to the other circumstances prevailing in the country at that point of a time, the patent policy changes were being introduced. What do we find? That private sector was conducting R&D, however limited to an adaptive nature. On the other hand, the most of the research which was being supported by the government was concentrated in the research labs which were being created by the government itself. They were not funding any research in the private sector or corporate sector as such. Then that is where the gap also began to emerge, because what you realize that the innovation which is not being happening in the CSIR labs or other public funded research organization, it was not reaching the market because these labs were not very well connected to the market. So this was the important critique of the way of working of these particular labs. Moreover, another study has pointed out that the average lag between the conception and the first sale, particularly with respect to the innovation of CSIR, was rather very high. So a study has compared the innovations coming from an industry, Excel Industries vis-a-vis that of the CSIR lab, and they found that the comparison of as high as 7 months vis-a-vis 7 years. So private companies, they were in contact with these CSIR labs. They were trying to understand the technologies these CSIR labs were developing. In fact, they were not only in contact with a lab, sometimes they might have contacts with more than one lab. However, these contacts were not materializing into something or coming up with a product or a know-how which the industries would be now selling in the market. Then another important concern that happened, that the Foreign Investment Board, they engaged with the CSIR scientists, and CSIR was indeed the representative of the technology available, or allowing the technology imports at that point of a time, which gives it a virtual veto in terms of what could be imported in the country. So then you do find that the surveys have highlighted that the companies complained that CSIR was indeed a major reason that there were delays in technology import also. So there was this kind of a mismatch, or you can say a gap remained, whereby though the research was happening, it was being conducted, it was being funded, it was failing to reach the masses. Then what were the key takeaways we have from what was going on in terms of research and development before major economic reforms happened? Here what we find that Indian firms now they have to produce everything locally. That was the major focus. Self-reliance was the major focus. That means they have to now increase their technological effort and get involved into the development of the wide-ranging products. That means once again engagement with the technology was there. However, the public funds which were being devoted to research and development, they did not lead to any kind of introduction of the newer products, and as a result what we find, a large proportion of publicly funded generated technology, they never reaches the shop floor. So this kind of a dichotomy between the government laboratories from manufacturing and marketing in fact led to a major disadvantage in terms of generation as well as in terms of selling of the technology based products. So there was a lack of focus on aspects of productivity and product improvement. But not everything was still everything was all not that bad, because what Sanjay Lal work has realized and identified that this kind of a protective environment which was being given of the domestic production and the emphasis which was given on domestic production and domestic technical effort indeed led to a creation of a certain amount of capabilities in the firms. It created a sophisticated base in industrial technologies, but also fostered a kind of an inefficiency because of the complacency which come because there is no competition. As a result, what happened that we were not able to sustain even the moderate rates of growth. Next, what we see is a major economic reform, unleashing the power of competition in the Indian industry. There what we find is there were several firms. They had indeed in-house R&D facilities and they were focusing on indigenization, and the patent and copyright legislations were also in place, and they were in fact changed in order to favor Indian firms, and there was also a demand for innovation, and the closed economy in fact meant that there was a little incentive to improve. With this changes in the economic situation, what we have now that across we will see the various foreign brands being visible, including Coca-Cola, Kai, Citibank, etc. So whether we are talking about fast moving consumer good or white goods or the services which are being provided. There was also a demand in or a boom in demand for the consumable goods. For instance, because of the high availability of a range of international quality consumer goods like refrigerators, two-wheelers and television. So we will have companies like Samsung and GE and the refrigerators by these companies, and Sony and Akai TV sets, they are competing with those of the Godrej, Voltas, BPL and Videocon. And when there are dramatic changes in the regulation, the tariffs came down heavily. For instance, all capital goods can now be imported at a nominal tariff of 20%. So the imports become cheaper, the competition in the market grew, and you can see the availability of a wide range of products which are coming from the foreign companies. So if you are located or situated during this kind of a situation where the overall macro environment in which we are operating is now changing very dramatically, you find that the companies has responded to these changes very differently. So the technology import continued even after the 1990s. The number and value of technology license in fact was 3 times as compared to the previous 5 years, and total investment in technology in fact by Indian industry increased, and though the proportion of import to local technology investments was more in favor of the import. So what does this number mean is that with the opening up of the market and also the ease of maybe the technology import, what happened, the technology imports continue. Once again we can go back to the decision of the firm whether to buy or whether to do it itself. So they did heavily dependent on import, but this kind of a relationship that was being viewed was not necessarily that of a substitution. That means they were not substituting this technology imports and not doing an in-house R&D. In-house R&D also increased, and this particular increase in the in-house R&D, one can always view as something which will now facilitate and kind of an adaptation of the imports that are being done. So overall, there were certain firms which improved their manufacturing efficiency. There were certain industries which restructured, and some increased their investment, and of course others, they did not fight. So that means the response to the very severe and the dramatic changes in the economic environment was either to fight or to flight. So some left the market, could not sustain their competition, but there were others who tried to improve the efficiency, they restructured, they started conducting in-house R&D. So some of these success stories which has been mentioned in Forbes article as well as in another article by Krishnan and Jha includes that of a Telco, Bajaj Auto, Ranbaxy, Forbes Marshall itself. So Telco, again, you see, is something, is like an India's largest commercial vehicle manufacturer. In fact, since beginning production, it was in collaboration with Mercedes-Benz in 1960s. And it has invested a large amount in in-house R&D capabilities. In fact, there were times when they wanted to have more collaboration with Mercedes as well as with Honda, but they did not get required approvals. So once, of course, the market opened in 1991, the data shows that Telco indeed has R&D staff of around 1200, and they were around spending 1.5% of their turnover on research and development. In fact, they came up with a prototype, an in-house developed small car, and at that time, the Ministry of Industry has in fact pointed out, they have termed that entire event as the proudest of all, for all Indians, because they realize it's an historic, event, because what we were seeing that India's first indigenously developed car. Then there was the case of Ranbaxy, which also increases in-house R&D, and it was in fact at that point of a time was largest homegrown pharmaceutical firm. Apart from that, you have a case like a Bajaj Auto and Forbes Marshall, which was a lead steam engineering and control instrumentation firm. In fact, a study by Desai points out that the Forbes Marshall, which has a sizable R&D at the time of the liberalization, but they were not developing new products. However, it was finding and developing indigenous substitutes for import, and under the old regime, it was also rather more cumbersome and very expensive to do the entire exercise. However, over a period of a time, it definitely improved and moved on to more and more investment in research and development. And the another case is that of Tata Group. It sold its personal product company to Tomco. So the response and reaction were varied, and I would really encourage you to look at this paper and also the other by Krishnan and Jha, and go through the case studies of these individual companies and try and see how they have responded to the changes in the competitive situation. So what were the key takeaways? Definitely there was an increase in the import of technology while also increasing the in-house product development like that of the Tata Motors. And this was indeed also to support the in-house R&D, to support the import of technology. Companies also invested in the ability to conceptualize product independently so that they can develop internationally, drive the development of product technology, like for instance Bajaj Auto's proprietary technology of digital twin spark ignition. And apart from that, we find very interesting trends like companies like Tata acquiring Jaguar Land Rover, once again to gain access to the international market and also their technologies. Now, if you see this kind of a response, and now we try and understand what has been going on in the last 2 decades. So though some companies responded by increasing their innovation, but there were certain challenges, and those challenges still remain. For instance, India was an early investor in research and development. Immediately after independence, the efforts were being made to engage in research and development, establish institutions. But what we find is that in terms of the research and development as a percentage of GDP, it rather remains very low. Here what we find is that the number ratio is between 0.6 to 0.9% of the GDP, whereas in countries like South Korea, Taiwan and China, the numbers have all substantially higher. Apart from that, we find that the research and development is concentrated in few industries. The top 5 industries include pharmaceuticals, automobile, technology hardware, software and electronics, which account for around 68% of the total industrial R&D. Within those, what we find even further, there is a concentration of research and development being conducted in few companies. And this is a rather worrying number, where you find that not many Indian firms are to be found if you look at the top 25 R&D spenders worldwide. So this very specific characteristics, if you look at it in terms of by the 2011, we have the share of the industry in R&D rather low, 35%. In developed economies, it is much higher, and the publicly funded research and development is rather high, and bulk of R&D again is done by the government, and small share is within the university system. In terms of the companies, we also find at least in 1991, private companies were engaged in 15%, whereas public 10%. The number has rather improved. So now 30% is being done by the private sector. This overall 35% has in fact grown, and private enterprises have now been engaged up to more than 40% in terms of research and development investment. Now, if you look at in terms of the overall absolute amount, what we find is that the research and development, there were two components to it. One is the capital and the another is current. The current is essentially spent on running the current situations, in the sense that the payments which will be made to the scientists and the researchers. Capital will engage in maybe building a lab, bringing in equipment, etc. So industrial R&D expenditure, in fact, it doubled between 8 and 18. And the current account component, that means where you are making payments to the researchers and scientists, it represents around 75% of the total R&D spending in India. There, as we said earlier, that still a concentration persists in terms of the sector which are engaged in research and development, which includes, to begin with, pharmaceutical and biotechnology, automobile, oil and gas, and this numbers actually come from CTIR's report, and you find that there are sectors like electronic and electrical equipment which spend around 1.3% of their revenues. And then we have sectors like electronic and electrical system which contribute around 1.3% to the investment. Now, this is an important chart which help you in placing the research and development expenditure, to say, in the international context. So here what they have done, they have identified that overall R&D expenditure being made in a particular sector, and then looked at the total number of firms. Okay, and they, let us say, these firms are coming from top 2500. So what you do is you go and identify top 2500 firms which are conducting research and development. Then what you do, you kind of segregate them into different sector. Clearly, pharmaceutical is at the top, which has 429 companies worldwide engaged in research and development. What is of interest to us is this other side of the table. What is this other side of the table telling us? This side is telling us from where these 429 companies coming from. 220 from US, 28 from Japan and 13 from India. So amongst the top 2500 companies which are spending on research and development, 429 are from pharmaceutical sector, and of which 13 are from India. Clearly China has much bigger number. And if you look at the other sector, electronic and electrical equipment, but there is no Indian company which is engaged in R&D in electronic and electrical equipment which falls within the top 2500 spenders on R&D. Okay, and clearly in software and computer services we find there are 4 companies, and though we identify that as a major export of the country, but only 4 companies are engaged there. If you look at in India, 150 are involved in America. So if you suppose you pick up the top 3 sector where you have 829 companies, 20 are from India. In the top 10 sectors, 26 companies are from India, and in the top 2500, what you realize, 32 companies are from India, whereas the number stands for 507 for China, 769 for US. Now, having understood that, yes, though globally we may not be doing as much of a research and development, but what is it that we are doing in terms of the investment and how those investment compare with the rest of the world. So here we have some promising number. What are those? For instance, in pharmaceutical sector, on an average internationally, 15.9% of the sales are being now spent on research and development. And if you look at the Indian numbers, we are inching towards the international average. In case of a software, we have much better number. So you have a global average of 10.8%, and you find some companies from India, again including Oracle and etc., which are spending more than the international average in India. Then we have, even in industrial engineering, the numbers are more or less inching towards the international average, and similarly for chemicals you find, and most importantly here you find some electronic and electrical equipment where the numbers are high. So we are hopeful that this zero number, where we find that no Indian company being engaged in electronic and electrical equipment, may over a period of a time in fact may change. Another parameter which we use to understand research and development is that of the patent. We have talked about earlier that in a knowledge production function, what you will have as a input coming in terms of research and development expenditure or the investments, and then you have the outcome in terms of the patent. Here you find that in 2018-19, most of the patents in India at that point of a time were coming from institutions like CSIR and IITs and Tata Motors, DRDO and TVS Motors and TCS. Then we look at top 10 Indian patentees at USPTO. It includes TCS, Wipro, clearly from the software sector. Including CSIR labs, you find in Indian institutions like IITs are also patenting at USPTO. And these are the non-resident patents. So even in the Indian context, what you find once you get a larger amount of patents coming from the non-resident patentees, including Qualcomm, Microsoft Technology, LG, and Huawei Technologies, etc. So with this, we will close our session on understanding the Indian case. At least we have a broader understanding of what has been going on with respect to the investments made in innovative activity in the country and the outcome in terms of patent. With regard to patent, we will have, as I said earlier, a much more elaborate discussion later. Thank you.